I'm not going to lie to you. I do realize it's actually been a little while since I've recorded a podcast segment about the UFC. I know that's very much not the standard for 100 Degrees. Usually the way that this podcast has worked is that I'll kick it off with a segment about the Edmonton Oilers, because in sports they really are my number one true love. And then I'll close it off with a segment about the UFC. It's been a little while since I've done that because I have to be honest with you. The UFC, in my opinion, is really at a point where it's struggling to generate, a whole lot of interest in what's going on. And it's a little bit hard to put my finger on exactly why that is. And I think that the fighters, they don't have the same character as they did a few years ago. They're just not interesting. Ilya Topuria is a great fighter, but I got to be honest with you, he's just not interesting. Merab Dvalishvili, actually, he can produce some very entertaining moments in the middle of a fight. I mean, especially when he fought Sean O'Malley, and he basically had the guy, he had him down and dominated and just completely under control, and he starts aping to the crowd. So that was, he's just doing like a pro wrestling video game taunt in the middle of this fight while he's just, while Sean O'Malley is down on the mat with no hope of getting back up. And I actually did like what Sean O'Malley said about about Dvalishvili's fight. His last fight here, where he just set the UFC record, for the most takedowns. And Sean O'Malley said, "Yeah, he wasn't going to set that. He wasn't going to set that record against me because he took me down. I didn't get back up." Just when he was acting like it was a brilliant decision that he made. That's hilarious. That's honestly the Sean O'Malley that I would like to see more of. I'd love to see more of a humble, self-effacing Sean O'Malley who can actually laugh at himself a little bit and, not run around pretending like he's supposed to be the greatest fighter in UFC history. But I mean, other than that, outside of those moments, really, what do you say about Merab Dvalishvili? I can barely pronounce his name, to be honest with you. So I just don't find him to be that interesting a character, for lack of any other better phrase. And so, yeah, it gets a little bit harder to find things to talk about. But as it just so happens, there is one upcoming fight here that I do find very interesting, and that's the one that's going to happen here in Vancouver in a few days' time. Rainier DeRidder is going to be in the main event against Brendan Allen. And to me, that is an incredibly interesting fight, not just on the merits of the guys that are in that fight. And those are two very good guys in that fight. But to me, what I find to be the most interesting thing about that fight is just really what it tells us about the MMA world as a whole and the way that it's been over the last little while. So, as I'm sure that a lot of people watching this must be aware, a couple of years ago, there was an organization by the name of Bellator. And I think that a lot of people had just assumed that Bellator, run by Scott Coker was like the Dana White of Bellator. And I think that people just assumed that Bellator was the number 2 MMA organization in the world. I mean, which organization is number 1? It is the UFC. Maybe it hasn't always been the UFC, but it certainly is now, and it certainly has been since they bought out Pride. And so people had just assumed that because they were American-based, and I think maybe that might have something to do with it, that Bellator was the number 2 MMA organization in the world. And I think that what we've discovered in recent months is that no, that's not the case. And so to get to this moment, one thing that did happen was that a couple of years ago, Scott Coker sold Bellator to the PFL, the Professional Fighting League, which, by the way, is a very interesting promotion. If you've never watched any of their cards, they do have an incredibly interesting format. And it is, in my opinion, like a fresh take on the sport. The whole having a season and then having fighters, accumulate points in their fights, and they can accumulate more points by winning early and more points by winning by knockdown and by knockout, pardon me, and things like that. And so PFL, in my opinion, they have an incredibly fresh take on the sport that just, in my opinion, it doesn't get the love that it deserves. You know, here in Canada, we used to get the PFL cards on Friday nights on TSN. That doesn't seem to happen anymore. It doesn't really seem to me like PFL actually has a TV deal. Anyhow, sorry, I'm getting off topic here. So I've got to come back to it. So the PFL, they bought Bellator. And for a little while, they kind of tried to run the two organizations separately. And then, you know, kind of abruptly here a few months ago, they just shut down Bellator and they released all of the Bellator fighters. Well, most of the Bellator fighters. I know that they definitely released most of the champions. And so UFC moved in and they started to scoop up a lot of these guys because it was a great moment to, you know, go out and acquire these great fighters that were going to help reinvigorate the UFC and push it into its next era. And instead, what we've seen is that the Bellator fighters, like, they've kind of gone over like a fart. And as much as I hate to say it, I mean, the experience of Michael Chandler in the lightweight division, which when he joined it was, in my opinion, and I am still of this opinion, that it was the best division in the history of mixed martial arts. But he didn't really show up and became, like, he showed up and they treated him like a huge star. Because in my opinion, he is a pretty big star. He's a great personality. He's a great character. He's a great fighter. But you look at what he's done in the UFC, his record since he's gotten here, you know, it's not that exciting. You know, he showed up saying that he was going to be the guy to go in and beat Khabib Nurmagomedov. You know, he was going to make Nurmagomedov like 29 and Chandler. And obviously, you know, that didn't happen. Like, he's lost a lot of, he's lost most of his highest profile fights. Looked great when he showed up and fought Dan Hooker. And I think everybody just assumed that he was going to be that guy, but then moving forward, I mean, you know, losing to Oliveira the way that he did, losing to Oliveira the way that he did the second time. I mean, you know, that was not pretty. Losing to Dustin Poirier, there's no shame in losing to Dustin Poirier. So don't get me wrong about that. But Michael Chandler, definitely, he did not show up and become the star that people thought that he was going to be. And so right then and there, this idea that Bellator was the #2 MMA organization in the entire world was already kind of like under some scrutiny. You know, it obviously was not quite, you know, not quite true. And so in the intervening months since then, you know, now suddenly they start to add all of these old Bellator fighters. And so you would expect that a lot of these guys that were champions in Bellator would come over to the UFC and they would be doing very well. But you know what? That honestly hasn't been the case. I mean, Patricio Pitbull came over. I believe that he's 1-1. I should have double-checked that before I started recording this video. So correct me if I'm wrong about that, but he lost his first fight. I think that he did manage to win the second, if I'm not mistaken. But Patchy Mix, who was also a Bellator champion, came over, and he did so poorly in his first fight that his second fight got knocked all the way down to the early prelims. Like, didn't even get onto the free TV before the pay-per-view. And, you know, he lost again. And this guy was a champion in Bellator. And now, not only is he losing to ranked opposition in the UFC, now he's losing to the guys that, you know, would have to beat a bunch of guys just to get into position to fight for a number. So I think at this point, it's kind of, you know, it's undisputable. Bellator was not the #2 organization in the world at any point. I think people just assumed it because it was, you know, a little closer to home. So that might raise a question. Who is the actual #2 MMA organization in the world? You got to look at Rainier DeWitter and look at everything that he's done since he's come into the UFC. I mean, he's already beaten Robert Whittaker. And Robert Whittaker has, for a lot of years, he's been the champion. And for quite a long time previous to this, he's basically been he was the number one, he was like the forever number one guy at middleweight. One of those guys in the organization who just couldn't beat the champion. So then he's the guy who just sits there at number one and makes all of the guys that are going to try to get a championship fight, try to go through him. And so Rainier DeWitter comes like out of nowhere, starts winning fights in the UFC, and now he's beating Robert Whittaker. So where did Rainier DeRidder come from? Well, he came from one championship. And so one championship, I mean, they have been around for quite a while. They haven't really gotten very much love out of the American TV market, which I think is a crying shame. You can watch pretty much like all of their stuff for free on YouTube, except for their pay-per-views. And the level of competition is really, really high. I think maybe the one thing that I would say about the one championship is that arguably, maybe they're trying to be too many things at a given time. Because it's not just MMA, they also have Muay Thai. They also have kickboxing, which is, by the way, distinct from Muay Thai in the sense that, like Muay Thai, you're talking about you've got the knees, you got the elbows, active clinches, very exciting sport. And I'm honestly a little bit mystified by how that's a fringe sport in North America, considering how popular combat sports have become. Like in particular, like the UFC, obviously, right? You would think that Muay Thai should be a much more popular sport here than it is, but you never see it on TV. You kind of have to go out of your way to find it. I think that's kind of a shame. But anyhow, so yeah, one championship. It's MMA, it's Muay Thai, it's kickboxing, and then of course you've also got the submission grappling. And at one point they were kind of starting to try to get into boxing, but in reality, I think the straight boxing didn't really go so well. So it's not really something that they seem to be doing now. I understand exactly why. But I think maybe that's the one knock that I have against one championship, is that it's too many different things. And there's a lot of champions walking around and you don't really even know who they are because they're having to share that attention with so many other organizations. So many other fighters, pardon me. So maybe that's the one negative thing that I would say about it. But I think that really, like Rainier DeRidder hitting in the UFC the way that he has, shouldn't be the thing that was necessary for one championship to get the attention that it deserves. Because really what it should have come down to was all the way back when the UFC decided that they were kind of done with Demetrius Johnson. Like they were done with Demetrius Johnson, but he wouldn't lose. So they couldn't cut him. And so they decided what they were going to do is that they were going to trade him away for another fighter. And so they actually executed a trade with another fight organization. And they said, we'll give you Demetrius Johnson and you give us Ben Askren. And I think that when they did the deal, the UFC, they really must have thought that they were getting the better of those of the two sides. I mean, otherwise, you don't do it. And I guess, in a sense, like they did get like one really cool thing out of it. They got the famous Jorge Masvidal, extremely necessary knockout. The flying knee that so many people basically, so many guys try to emulate that now. And so they did get that moment. So, okay, cool, fair enough. But aside from that, no, they didn't really get that much out of Ben Askren. He wasn't the fighter that they thought that they were getting, that's for sure. Pardon me. And so, just look at what Demetrius Johnson did after he went over to one championship. There was a guy there that actually managed to beat him and become their flyweight champion for a little while. Like Moraes. Pedro Moraes? I'd have to double check it. I'd have to double check the name. I should have done that before I started, but I'm kind of stuck with it now. I don't think that there's any overstating how big a deal that is exactly. Because, I mean, if you ask me, and I know that a lot of people feel this way, if you were to have a vote tomorrow for who is the GOAT of MMA, like the greatest of all time, John Jones does not even appear on my ballot, but Demetrius Johnson certainly does. You know, he fought in a division that the UFC at the time, they didn't really care for. They actually tried to get away with it. They tried to do away with it. And Henry Cejudo, fortunately, thwarted them in that ambition. But One Championship is an organization that has a high enough level of talent that a guy like Demetrius Johnson can go there and lose. That's not a knock against Demetrius Johnson. That's a statement of exactly how high the level of quality of the talent that One Championship has. That's a comment on that. And I don't think that Rainier DeRidder, I don't know why I must have a lisp that I don't know about. I don't think that Rainier DeRidder is the last One Championship guy who's going to come to the UFC and hit. They have all kinds of other guys over there that could come over here and I think be a real factor in the UFC. I think that Jeremy Harrison could come over to the UFC and be a huge factor. I think that I think there's going to be a bidding war when Malikin's contract finally goes up. And there's definitely going to be a bidding war to try to bring him over. I mean, he's probably one of the only guys in the sport who's been a champion at 3 weight classes. Like, that's almost unheard of. I mean, Alex Pereira could definitely do it. But there are not that many guys out there who are going to succeed at 3 different weight classes, let alone be a champion. And Malikin is a guy that could definitely do that. You know, the guy who is currently the One Championship heavyweight champion, Rug. I think that eventually the UFC is going to be salivating to try to bring that guy over and try to create a new star in the mold of Francis Ngannou. And I think that Rug is that guy. And meanwhile, we get all these Bellator guys and they come over and they just kind of, flop. You know, not all of them flop. I wouldn't say that Michael Chandler actually flopped. Like, he's been very competitive in the UFC. A lot of people don't like to give him credit for that, but he's been very competitive. He just hasn't taken over the division the way that a lot of people thought that he was. So without all of that in mind, there's no doubt in my mind, like, One Championship is the number 2 organization in MMA right now, and they have been for years. And I think that when we see Rainier DeRidder do whatever it is that he does in that cage in Vancouver on Saturday, I think that a lot of people are finally going to have to give One Championship its flowers. And, if you wanted to invest the time in actually watching One Championship, it's a good organization. That's time really well spent.